Hello friends, welcome to Bhayani Nirmal, and now we will discuss about the programmed cell death or apoptosis, and this is the first lecture video in the apoptosis series. And in this lecture video mainly I shall tell you about the basic concept of the apoptosis and the differences in between apoptosis and the necrosis, and the types of the cells or the examples of the few cells which undergoes the apoptosis, okay, and also how apoptosis is occurred. Okay, and in the second lecture video we will discuss about the apoptosis program in the C. elegans, and C. elegans is a model animal, is a nematode, and the apoptosis program in the C. elegans is very important for further understanding of the apoptosis in human. So I shall describe about the C. elegans apoptosis in the second lecture video, and in the third lecture video I shall tell you about the various pathways of the apoptosis in human, that is the extrinsic pathway, intrinsic pathway, and the mitochondrial pathway. So when you want to read about the apoptosis, and you should know all of this. Okay, now what is programmed cell death actually? And you know that in our body there are present various types of cells, and each cells have a specific lifespan. Okay, like RBC actually perform its function for 120 days, and after then this RBC becomes died. Okay, and the death of this RBC is occurred by the process of apoptosis or the programmed cell death. In every day about 5 into 10 to the power 11 number of the blood cells are actually eliminated by the process of apoptosis. So apoptosis is very important, or the programmed cell death is very important. But here I can tell you that apoptosis and the programmed cell death are not actually similar. Okay, and the apoptosis is a type of programmed cell death. So first I shall tell you that what is programmed cell death, and then we will discuss about the apoptosis. So by the programmed cell death, a cell becomes died, and you all know that the death is always harmful. Okay, but by the process of programmed cell death, a cells becomes died, and this is very important for our developmental program, and this also maintain the tissue structure, the adult tissue structure actually. Okay, so programmed cell death is very important, and if any problem is occurred in programmed cell death, then we can suffer from various types of disease like Alzheimer's disease, like acquired immunodeficiency syndrome. So these diseases can be occurred if any problem is seen in cases of apoptic program or the programmed cell death. Okay, so programmed cell death is an active physiological process by which a normal cell becomes died, and the death of the cell is occurred by the programmed cell death. Okay, and many of the genes are involved in the programmed cell death process. Okay, if a cell receives the developmental signal for death, or the environmental signal for death, or physiological damage, then these cells becomes died. Okay, so this is actually the basic concept of the programmed cell death. So by the process of programmed cell death, the genes are involved, and this causes the death of a cell. Okay, but apoptosis is a type of programmed cell death, and it is an active physiological process, and apoptosis required the adenosine triphosphate or ATP. So what is apoptosis? Apoptosis is the inherent cellular mechanism, that is the genes. Okay, but apoptosis is a type of programmed cell death, and it is an active physiological process, and apoptosis required the adenosine triphosphate or ATP. So what is apoptosis? Apoptosis is the inherent cellular mechanism, that is the genes are actually involved by the process of apoptosis. Okay, so this is called as the inherent cellular mechanism that lead the cell destruction, characterized by a pattern of morphological and the physiological changes. So by the process of apoptosis, many genes are involved, and this will causes the changes in morphology and the physiology of that cell, and after then these cells becomes died, or the suicide of the cell is occurred. Okay, so this is actually called as apoptosis, or the death of the cell or the suicide of the cell is called as apoptosis, and apoptosis is a type of programmed cell death, right? Apoptosis is occurred in two phases. One is the latent phase, and another is the execution phase. Okay, so latent phase is the preparing phase of the apoptosis, and this will take a huge time, right? And when a cell receives the death signal, or any trauma is applied in a cell, then this cell is prepared for apoptosis. So this preparing phase is called as the latent phase, and during the time of the latent phase, a cell appears normal. Okay, the latent phase is divisible into two subphases. One is the condemned phase and another is committed phase. And in the condemned phase, already cell receives a death signal, but this can rescue from this death signal. That is, they can become normal. So this phase is called as the condemned phase. But when a cell enters into the committed phase, okay, then this cell cannot be rescued. Okay, so this cell must undergoes into the apoptosis. So from the condemned phase, a cell may be rescued from the apoptosis or may be rescued from the death. But when a cell enters into the committed phase, then this cell must enters into the apoptosis or the suicide. Okay, so this is a normal cell and this receive a trauma, and this is preparing for apoptosis. Okay, and then this undergoes the latent phase, and you know that the latent phase takes a huge time. Okay, and when cell enters into the committed phase, then these cells must undergo into the apoptosis. And the main phase of the apoptosis is the execution, and during which the morphological and the physiological changes is occurred, and during this time the bleeding of the cell is occurred, the bleeding of the plasma membrane and the nuclear membrane is occurred, and also the apoptic body or the apoptic vesicles is formed, and this is actually the process of the apoptosis. Okay, so the morphological changes is occurred, and this actually causes the destruction of the cell. This actually causes the death of the cell. So the execution phase is the morphological changes. Okay, and this actually causes the death of the cell. Now, what are the death signal? That is, what are the signals that a cell receive and enters into the latent phase, and after the latent phase this undergoes the execution. Okay, so what are these type of the death signal? By a lack of the survival signal, if a cell lack the survival signal, then this cell must undergoes the latent phase and next into the execution phase, that is the cell death or the suicide. Okay, and by the developmental death signal and contradictory cell cycle signaling, and you know that the cell cycle is very important for the life of a cell, and if any of the contradiction or the problem is actually occurred during the time of the cell cycle, then this cell must undergo into the execution phase of the apoptosis, or these cells must undergoes the death. Okay, the ligation of the cell surface receptor, and every cells there are present the receptor in the plasma membrane, and if any of proteins that actually causes the apoptosis, or this will actually causes the death of the cell, and this is actually called as the ligation of the cell surface receptor. By DNA damage as a cause of defect in the DNA repair mechanism, and you know that after the DNA replication, the DNA repair mechanism will be very crucial. If any defect is occurred during the time of DNA repair mechanism, this cell must undergo suicide program. Okay, and the treatment with the cytotoxic drugs or the irradiation, and when a cell is treated with the cytotoxic drug or any of the radiation, then this cell undergoes the apoptosis. Okay, what types of the cells undergoes the apoptosis? Many cells undergoes the apoptosis, and you can see that these cells may be of the harmful, this cell may be defective, and this cell may be excess, that is no needs in our body, and unnecessary cells and the obsolete cells, and there are so many types of cells which undergoes into the apoptosis. So first one is the harmful cell, the T cell. Okay, and during the time of development of the T cell in the thymus, and in the T cell there are developed the T cell receptor. Okay, and if defect in the T cell receptor is occurred, so if the defect of the T cell receptor is occurred, then these T cells cannot recognize the self and the non-self antigen, and so these cells must undergo into the apoptosis. Cells with the damaged DNA, and when a cell the DNA is damaged, when in a cell the DNA is damaged, okay, so this cell undergoes apoptosis. So this is the damaged DNA, and this cell must undergo the apoptosis, and also the harbor the infectious agent, and the some cells also harbor the many of the viruses. Okay, so these virus infected cells are usually destroyed by interferon, but sometimes this undergoes the apoptosis. Okay, and this will prevent the spread of the virus in our body. So these are the harmful cells. So a defect in the T cell receptor and which cannot recognize the self and non-self antigen, then this will undergoes the apoptosis, and the damaged DNA containing cell also undergoes the apoptosis, and all the cells which harbor the viruses or the infectious agent, this will undergoes the apoptosis. Okay, next is the defective cell. The 95% of the T cells are usually defective of the B cells, and you know that the B cells are developed into the bone marrow. Okay, and the B cells actually produces the antibody, right? And these any of the B cells which do not produce the sufficient amount of the antibody, this will be eliminated in our body. Okay, so 95% of the T cells and many of the B cells which do not produce the sufficient amount of the antibody, this will becomes eliminated by the process of apoptosis. Next, unnecessary cells, that is the tissue webbing in the hands and feet, and yeah, in our hands there are presence of the fingers, and you know that the ancestral character is that there are presence of the web-like structure in between the fingers and in between the fingers of hands and the legs. Okay, and this web structure are actually eliminated by the process of apoptosis, right? And the Mullerian duct in the male, and during the time of development of the sexual organ development in cases of the human, the Mullerian duct is developed into the oviduct in cases of the female. So there is no need of the Mullerian duct in cases of the male, and so that this Mullerian duct becomes eliminated by the process of apoptosis. Next is the obsolete cell, the metamorphosis in the insect and the tadpole, and during the time of metamorphosis of the insect and the amphibians, and the many cells are actually shed off from their body. Okay, and this is actually occurred by the process of apoptosis. Mammary epithelial cells after the lactation, and the lactation is actually the process by which the milk is produced in human female breast. Okay, and just after the lactation process, due to the lack of the hormone, and these epithelial cells of the mammary gland becomes eliminated by the process of apoptosis. Okay, and the prostate cells in cases of the male, and just after performing their function, the prostate cells becomes eliminated in cases of the male, and these are usually occurred due to the lack of the hormone. Okay, and so these are actually very, very important. So hormone actually plays a crucial role for surviving for survival of a cell. Okay, and lack of the estrogen or the prolactin hormone, this will causes the mammary epithelial cells undergoes into the apoptosis, and also the due to the lack of the testosterone, this will causes the prostate cells undergoes into the apoptosis. Okay, so survival signal by the hormone is one important treatment for the breast cancer and the prostate cancer, and this is actually called as the hormone replacement therapy. Okay, now the death of a cell is usually occurred by two ways. One is apoptosis and another is necrosis. Necrosis is the accidental cell death and apoptosis is the programmed cell death. So necrosis is accidental cell death. So necrosis, accidental cell death, right? And apoptosis is a type of programmed cell death. And this is tightly regulated process. This is tightly regulated process. Okay, so apoptosis is usually occurred due to the tissue damage. So necrosis is usually occurred due to the tissue damage. Necrosis is usually occurred by the tissue damage or the trauma, that is the ischemic trauma or the absence of the oxygen, and also the extreme temperature, okay, or extreme environmental condition, extreme environmental signal. So this will causes the necrosis, right? And now apoptosis is usually occurred due to the presence of death signal, and also absence of survival signal. So absence of survival signal, right? And we will focus mainly on the apoptosis, but to understand about the apoptosis, you should know how the necrosis is occurred, okay? And you should also know about the differences in between apoptosis and the necrosis, okay? So when any trauma is occurred or any damage is actually applied in a branch of cell or in a region in our body, okay, and so this will causes the permeability of the plasma membrane. So by the process of necrosis, the permeability of the plasma membrane increase. So permeability increase, okay, and due to the increase of the permeability, rush of the water into the cell. So rush of water into cell, okay. So water enters into the cell. Also when any of the tissue damage is occurred, then the permeability of the plasma membrane is increased. And now I am telling about you how the necrosis is occurred. And when trauma or the any damage is occurred in our body, and this will increase the permeability of the membrane, and due to the increase of the permeability of the membrane, the water enters into the cell, okay, and this will swell the cell. So cell swelling is occurred. So this will swelling of the cell, okay. So due to the entry of the water into the cell becomes swell, and this will activate the lytic enzyme, okay. So here activate lytic enzyme, activate lytic enzymes, okay. So these are the intercellular junction, and which I have drawn in the green color. So by the process of necrosis, the water enters into the cell because due to the increase of the permeability of the plasma membrane, and this will activate the lytic enzyme, and this will causes the breakdown of cell organelle, okay. So occurred due to the activation of the lytic enzyme and the cell lysis So these breakage cellular organelle or other content actually released into the environment. So this will be released into environment, and it leads to inflammation. And this leads to inflammation. And you know that the inflammation or the inflammatory response is a type of innate immunity, okay. And so necrosis actually causes the inflammation, okay. So this is the process of necrosis, and by which the death is occurred by the process of accident, okay. Now apoptosis. And the apoptosis is the programmed cell death, and this is a tiny regulated process, okay. And due to the absence of the death signal or the absence of the survival signal, a cell becomes died, a cell death is occurred, a cell suicide is occurred, okay. So here you can see that a branch of the cells, and each of the cells are actually connected by the intercellular junction, and also these are the microvilli, okay. And due to the absence of the survival signal, or due to the presence of the death signal, the first event which is occurred, the microvilli disappear. So here you can see that there are presence of 3 cells, of which the middle cells undergoes the apoptosis. So the microvilli are disappear, okay, and also the cell junction in between the cells also eliminated. So microvilli disappear, and the cell junction also disappear. Cell junction also disappear, okay. And where in cases of the necrosis, the permeability of the cell become increased, and this actually causes the enters of water, but by the process of apoptosis, the integrity of the plasma membrane becomes destroyed, okay. So integrity of the plasma membrane loss, integrity of the plasma membrane also losses, asymmetry also loss, right. and you know that the phosphatidyl serine in the inner leaflet of the plasma membrane, and when a cell undergoes the apoptosis, then these phosphatidyl serine molecules can be found in both of the leaflet of the plasma membrane. So the asymmetry of the plasma membrane losses, and in these cases the cell shrink. So the cell shrinkage, okay, so by the process of apoptosis the cell shrinkage, but in cases of necrosis, whereas the cell swell, but by the process of apoptosis the shrinkage of the cell is occurred, right? And next is that the chromosome condensation, and here you can see that these are the condensation of the chromosome or the hyper condensation of the chromosome. So the chromosome condensation is occurred, so chromosome hyper condensation actually show hyper condensed, chromosome becomes hyper condensed, right? And then the margination of the hyper condensed chromosome in the nuclear membrane, the margination in nuclear membrane, okay? And the next step is of the apoptosis is the blebbing of the plasma membrane and the nuclear membrane. So these are the blebbing, okay? So blebbing of the nuclear membrane of the plasma membrane, blebbing of nuclear membrane and plasma membrane. So blebbing of nuclear membrane and plasma membrane, okay? And this will produce the apoptic bodies, and this will produce the apoptic bodies. So these are apoptic bodies, right? So these are apoptic bodies, and these apoptic bodies contains the hypercondensed chromatin and also the many of the cellular organelles, okay? And the cell content do not released into the environment actually, and this will be confined, the cellular content will be confined in the apoptic bodies, right? And next the phagocytosis, and next phagocytosis by neighboring cell. So neighboring cell actually phagocytosed this apoptic cell. So here you can see that the neighboring cell and these are actually tried to phagocytosed these apoptic bodies, okay? And no inflammation, and here no inflammation. So in cases of apoptosis no inflammation is occurred, but by the process of necrosis the inflammation is occurred, okay? So these are the basic differences in between the necrosis and the apoptosis, where the necrosis is the accidental cell death, but apoptosis is a programmed cell death. It is a tiny regulated process and various genes are involved during the time of apoptosis. And the necrosis do not require the ATP, but apoptosis require ATP, okay? So this is the energy requiring process, okay? Next, the water rushes into the cells during the time of necrosis, but in cases of the apoptosis, actually the integrity of the plasma membrane breaks, and the asymmetry also or losses in the plasma membrane, okay? And also the microvilli and the intercellular junctions becomes losses, or this becomes eliminated, okay? And the cell shrinkage rather than cell swell, okay? And the condensation, hypercondensation of the chromatin is occurred, and this hypercondensed chromatin becomes marginated in the nuclear membrane, okay? And next this will actually produce the many of the apoptic bodies, and these apoptic bodies are phagocytosed by the neighboring cell or any of the phagocytic cell. But in cases of the necrosis, the swelling of the cell, and this causes the breakdown of the various cellular organelles, okay? And this cellular content actually comes to the environment, but in cases of apoptosis the cellular content do not comes into the environment, okay? So this is the basic differences in between apoptosis and the necrosis. And next tutorial video I shall tell you about the apoptosis program in the C. elegans and the role of various genes, that is the ERG1, SAID1, SAID2, SAID3 and the SAID4 genes in apoptosis of the C. elegans, okay?